She wore the ruins of her wedding veil like a crown, and that single act of defiance brought the most dangerous man in Boston through the cathedral doors. If you've ever been humiliated by the people who were supposed to love you, stay until the very end, because this story is for you. Watch until the last second, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The veil had survived 230 years. It had crossed an ocean inside a cedar trunk lined with lavender silk, survived a fire that took half a merchant's warehouse in 1887, outlasted 3 generations of women who wore it not because it was fashionable, but because it was theirs. A piece of something older than money, older than the kind of power that got displayed at charity galas and printed in society columns. The lace had been worked by hand in a village in northern Italy by a woman whose name no one remembered anymore, and it was so fine, so impossibly precise in its construction that even under magnification the threads appeared to breathe. Restoration artists had studied photographs of it. Museum curators had written to acquire it. Every offer had been declined. Vivian Hale had spent 4 months with that veil before today, and in those 4 months she had come to understand it the way she understood very few things in her life. Completely, and with a quiet reverence that had nothing to do with its price. Now she stood in the bridal preparation room of the Cathedral of St. Ambrose in a white dress that cost more than her apartment, staring at what was left of it. The cuts were not accidental. Scissors don't slip through antique needlepoint lace in 4 separate diagonal lines. Scissors don't sever the original Italian silk binding along the top edge with that kind of deliberate precision unless the hands holding them knew exactly what they were doing and did not care. The veil lay across the dressing table in pieces, not destroyed completely, but wounded in a way that made the message unmistakable. You don't belong here, you never did, and now everyone will see it. Vivienne didn't move for almost 30 seconds. She could hear the cathedral filling on the other side of the wall. 500 guests, Boston's entire upper tier, the old money families, the new money families pretending to be old money, the politicians whose careers Grant Blackwell's father had quietly financed over 2 decades, the newspaper editors, the gallery owners, the women who ran charitable foundations as a second career and used galas as a battlefield. She could hear the low orchestral murmur of the string quartet that Grant's mother had hired without consulting her, playing something classical and tasteful, and entirely chosen to remind everyone in the building that this wedding belonged to the Blackwells, not to the woman walking down the aisle. She picked up the largest piece of the veil with both hands. The cut edges trembled slightly in the air conditioning. Behind her, the door opened without a knock. Margot Blackwell entered the way she entered every room she considered hers, which was every room she had ever been in, with her shoulders back and her chin at an angle that managed to be simultaneously gracious and contemptuous. She was 61 years old and looked 53 and spent a significant portion of each month ensuring that gap never closed. Her dress was a slate gray column of Italian silk. Her earrings were emerald. Her expression, when she saw Vivian holding the cut lace, shifted for 1 fraction of a second into something that was almost satisfaction before she rearranged it into concern. "Oh," she said. "How dreadful. What happened?" Vivian turned around slowly. She looked at Margot Blackwell's face. She looked at the earrings. She looked at the way Margot's right hand was clasped over her left wrist, a gesture she made when she was controlling something. Vivian had catalogued it over 16 months of Sunday dinners and charity events and quiet weekend visits where she had slowly, steadily understood that the warmth being extended to her was purely performative, a holding pattern, a strategy. "Where's Celeste?" Vivian asked. "Celeste is with the guests." A pause, perfectly timed. "Vivian, darling, I know this is upsetting, but perhaps we can simply— Where are the scissors?" The pause this time was shorter but harder. "I beg your pardon?" "The scissors." Vivienne set the ruined veil down on the table with both hands, the same care she used with every piece she had ever worked on, even the broken ones, especially the broken ones. "This lace is 230 years old. The cut edges are clean. Someone used good scissors, and they used them recently because the silk hasn't had time to fray yet." She looked up. "Where are Celeste's scissors?" Margot's expression went through several small adjustments that a less attentive observer might have missed entirely. Her composure was extraordinary. Vivian had always given her that, even when she hated her for it. The woman could rearrange her face the way a card player rearranged a hand. "I think," Margot said finally, with a warmth that had the texture of something carved, "that you are under a great deal of stress today, and that you are allowing your imagination get out." The quiet in the room after those two words was different from the quiet before them. Margot Blackwell had not been told to get out of anywhere in recent memory. That was visible in the brief stillness that passed through her whole body, a kind of reset, like a program encountering a line of code it wasn't written to handle. Then her chin came up another fraction of an inch. "Excuse me. Get out of this room," Vivian said. Her voice was even. That surprised her. She had been shaking 2 minutes ago, and now she was not. And she understood that the shaking had been fear, and the stillness was something else, something that had been building for 16 months of Sunday dinners and careful smiles and the persistent, low-frequency message being transmitted to her from every direction that she was tolerated here. She was a guest in this world, and her welcome was entirely conditional. Margot left. She didn't rush. She took her time with it, which was its own kind of message. When the door closed, Vivian turned back to the veil. She stood there for a long time. She was 31 years old. She had grown up in Dorchester, the daughter of a woman who altered other people's wedding dresses for a living, and a man who had left before she was old enough to remember his face. She had gotten a scholarship to the Massachusetts College of Art and Design on the basis of a portfolio she had assembled on a second-hand laptop and submitted 6 weeks before the deadline. She had spent the first 2 years of her career doing inventory work in museum storage rooms for $12 an hour, learning to identify textiles by touch, the way other people identified voices. She was genuinely gifted, in the specific and unglamorous way that genuine gifts usually manifest, through obsessive attention, through willingness to do the work no one else wanted to do, through the particular patience required to restore something broken without erasing what the breaking had been. Grant Blackwell had found her at a benefit auction where one of her restoration pieces was on display. He had stood in front of it for 11 minutes before anyone introduced them, and when they finally spoke, he had asked questions that suggested he actually understood what he was looking at. She had found that disarming. She had let herself be disarmed. That had been 2 years ago. She thought about the last 2 years. She thought about the way his family had received her. The warmth that was always slightly performative, the introductions that came with unnecessary clarifiers. She does restoration work, antiques, that sort of thing. The holiday dinners where Celeste made comments that sat right on the border of insult and plausible deniability, the way Grant had a talent for being on the other side of the room when those moments happened. She thought about the engagement announcement in the Globe that had somehow included a photograph of Grant with his parents, and not one of the two of them together. She thought about the way Margot had suggested, just 3 weeks ago, with that same carved warmth, that perhaps the antique veil was a bit much. Perhaps something modern, something clean, something that didn't belong to Vivian. She picked the veil up again, all the pieces of it. She held them in her hands and she felt the weight of them, and she thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She had 2 options. She could send someone to find a replacement, a satin ribbon, a clip of flowers, something that would allow the ceremony to proceed and allow everyone present to believe that whatever had happened was a small, unfortunate accident, and that Vivian Hale was gracious and accommodating and above all untroubling, which was the thing she had been working hardest to be for the past 16 months. Or she could walk out there exactly as she was. She gathered the pieces of the veil. She arranged them in her hair with her own hands, the way she would have arranged a restoration piece, honoring the damage, not hiding it. The cut edges caught the light. The torn silk hung in deliberate disarray. It looked, she thought, like something that had survived something. She picked up her bouquet. She walked to the door. The cathedral was full. She understood that the moment she stepped into the back of the nave and the string quartet played the opening notes of the processional. 500 faces turned. 500 sets of eyes registered the veil, the torn edges, the hanging pieces of cut lace. And there was a collective hesitation in the room, a held breath, the social equivalent of a car accident that everyone sees coming. Vivian walked. She kept her chin level. She kept her eyes forward on the altar where Grant stood in his morning suit with his best man and the officiant, and she watched his face as she approached, and she saw the moment he understood what he was looking at. Something moved behind his eyes, something that she had once believed was depth, and now recognized as calculation. He was already assessing, already running options. His smile did not falter, because Grant Blackwell had his mother's gift for composure, and that was the thing that told her everything she needed to know. He would make this smooth. He would explain it away, absorb it, convert it into a story that the family could manage. A small disaster overcome with good humor, proof of Vivian's charm and resilience, a charming anecdote for the anniversary parties. And she would watch it happen, and she would know that she had spent 2 years being quietly absorbed into a machine designed to process people like her into something manageable. And by the time she understood it fully, she would already be inside it. She stopped 10 feet from the altar. Grant's smile held. "Vivian, I know what happened to the veil," she said. Her voice carried. In a cathedral, everything carries. The string quartet had stopped playing. "We can talk about that," he started. "Your mother and your sister were in that room," she said. "And you knew. You didn't know it would be the veil specifically, maybe. But you knew something was going to happen, and you made a choice not to be somewhere that would require you to prevent it. That's not a mistake. That's a decision." She heard Margot's voice from somewhere in the front pews, a low, controlled sound of social horror, not at the content of what was being said, but at the fact of it being said here, in front of these people, in a room where the ceiling was 60 feet high and every word was landing in the ears of everyone who mattered to the Blackwells. "Vivian," Grant stepped toward her. His voice had dropped to something that was meant to be intimate, but was actually management. "This is not the place." "You're right," she said. "It isn't. None of this is the place. I've been in the wrong place for 2 years. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not marrying you." She heard a sound that was possibly 500 people taking a collective breath, and then the cathedral doors opened. She didn't look right away. She felt it. The way the room shifted, the way 500 people turned simultaneously toward a point behind her, the way the particular social tension that had been filling the space converted suddenly into something else, something with a colder edge, a different frequency. The string quartet did not resume playing. The officiant had gone very still. She turned around. The man standing at the back of the cathedral was not a guest. He was tall, not dramatically so, but tall enough that the doorframe framed him in a way that felt deliberate, and the light from outside was behind him, and the combination of those things meant that for the first 2 seconds he was more silhouette than person. He wore a dark charcoal suit, no tie, and moved down the center aisle with the specific quality of someone who had never in his adult life needed to announce his presence, and had therefore never developed the habit of doing so. He simply arrived, and things adjusted around him. Vivienne would learn later that his name was Damien Vescari. At this moment, she knew only that he was walking toward her, that everyone in the building seemed to know who he was, and that the temperature of the room had dropped by several degrees in the 20 seconds since the doors had opened. He stopped when he was 12 feet from her. His eyes went to the veil. She watched his face change. It wasn't a dramatic shift. No gasp, no theatrical display of emotion. It was smaller than that and more complete. Something behind his eyes went very still, the way a body goes still when it's receiving information that requires total concentration to process. He looked at the torn lace in her hair, at the cut pieces hanging against her neck, and something in his jaw tightened by 1/fraction of a millimeter. And the temperature in that 12-foot distance between them felt like it dropped another several degrees. When he looked up from the veil to her face, his expression had reassembled into something controlled and unreadable. But he had been somewhere else for those 3 seconds, somewhere the rest of the room hadn't been able to follow, and she had seen it. He looked past her to Grant Blackwell. "Where?" he said, not loudly, but in the particular register that doesn't need volume, "did that veil come from?" It was not a question. Grant's composure, she noticed, had finally cracked. He had gone pale in the specific way that people go pale when they are trying not to show fear and failing. His best man had taken a small step backward. "Mr. Viscari," Grant said, "this is a private mutt." "I'm not talking to you yet," Damien said. He looked back at Vivian. "You." A pause. "Who sold it to you?" She blinked. "No one sold it to me. It was given to me. As a gift." Something moved across his face. "By who?" "By Grant's mother." She watched his eyes. "Allegedly a family piece. Allegedly acquired at an estate sale in Florence 8 years ago. She paused. You know this veil. He didn't answer that directly. He looked back at Grant, and whatever was on his face at that moment had the effect of making Grant Blackwell take a physical step backward, which was remarkable, because Grant Blackwell had not taken a physical step backward from anything in her experience. Blackwell. His voice was still even. Your family purchased something that did not belong to them. I assure you the provenance is entirely... The provenance, Damien said, and something in the word had a weight that silenced the room completely, is that this veil was made for my grandmother in 1791 and was in my mother's possession when she died, and it disappeared the same night she did, and your family acquired it through channels that I will be examining in detail, starting tomorrow morning. He paused. Starting tonight. Grant opened his mouth, closed it. Damien turned back to Vivian. He looked at her for a moment, and his expression was, she struggled to identify it. Not kind, exactly, not warm, but there was something in it that she would think about for a long time afterward, a kind of recognition, the look of someone who has seen a thing they were not expecting to see. I'm sorry, he said, about the veil. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, it's not your fault. No, he agreed. It isn't. He didn't look away from her. It's theirs. He turned then, not to Grant, but to the room. All 500 guests. He swept his gaze across them with the particular ease of someone who had no anxiety about being looked at, who had in fact spent his entire adult life in rooms where being looked at was a form of power. The Blackwell family, he said, and his voice was a carrying instrument that the cathedral amplified without distortion, has a habit of taking things that don't belong to them and displaying them as trophies. Today the guests of this wedding are witnesses. What was done to this woman? He did not gesture toward Vivian, but the room understood who he meant. And what was done to this piece of history will be answered for, publicly, completely. A pause so brief it barely registered. Every account, every asset, every silent partnership, and every quiet understanding that has kept this family in the position it occupies. He let that sit in the air for 2 full seconds. Enjoy your champagne. He walked back up the aisle. The doors opened before he reached them. He was gone. The room took approximately 7 seconds to reconstitute itself. Then everything happened at once. Vivian stood at the front of the cathedral while 500 people around her began the social equivalent of a controlled explosion. Voices low and urgent, faces leaning toward each other, phones appearing in hands that had kept them politely pocketed for the past hour. Grant was speaking to someone, a man in a gray suit who had the look of a lawyer or crisis manager, and his color had not returned. Margot was moving through the guests with the efficiency of someone conducting damage control, touching arms, managing expressions, deploying the 40-year-old social infrastructure of a woman who had survived worse public moments than this. But Vivian watched people's faces as Margot approached them, and she watched what happened to those faces. The way the social warmth that had always been automatic with the Blackwell name had developed a new hesitation, a recalculation, a fractional withdrawal. Damien Vescari had said 12 sentences, and Margot Blackwell looked, for the first time in Vivian's memory, genuinely uncertain. Celeste appeared at Grant's elbow. She was 28 and had her mother's bone structure and her father's bluntness and none of either person's sophistication, and she was looking at Vivian with an expression that had collapsed entirely into naked anger, shorn of the plausible deniability she usually maintained around it. The scissors comment, the always conditional warmth. It was all there now, undressed. You have no idea, Celeste said, close enough that her voice didn't carry. What you just did. Vivian looked at her. I didn't do anything. You let him... I didn't let him do anything. She looked at the anger on Celeste's face, and she felt nothing, she realized. Not triumph, not fear. Something more like clarity. The feeling after a long illness when you first understand that you have been sick and that the sickness is ending. I walked down an aisle and I told the truth. Everything else was already in motion. She walked past Celeste. She walked through the guests, who parted for her in small clusters, faces turned toward her with expressions she didn't have the energy to categorize. She walked to the back of the cathedral and through the doors and out into the cool October air of the city, and she stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. Her dress was the most expensive thing she had ever worn, Her veil was destroyed. She was unemployed. The Blackwell Commission had been the center of her professional life for 6 months, and that was over now in ways she hadn't fully calculated yet. Her apartment was a sublet she had taken to be closer to Grant's neighborhood, and the lease ran out in 43 days. Her savings were careful, but not deep. She looked at the city. She had been looking at it for 31 years, from different angles and different distances, and it had always looked like a place she was working toward, a place where the combination of talent and persistence would eventually generate something stable, something that was hers. She wondered now if that calculation had been correct. The car appeared at the curb before she had finished the thought. It was black, low, expensive, without being ostentatious, and the driver was out of it before it fully stopped, opening the rear door without any theatrical efficiency. Just the smooth movement of someone doing his job. He did not look at her. He looked at a point several feet to her left. "Ms. Hale." She stared at the car. "Mr. Vescari would like to speak with you at your convenience," the driver said. He still wasn't looking at her. "He says he can explain about the veil. Mr. Vescari doesn't know me." "No, ma'am." A pause. "He says he knows the veil." She stood on the steps for a moment longer. Behind her, the cathedral was still buzzing. She could feel it through the stone, the social machinery running at high speed, the Blackwells working the room, the crisis being managed. She thought about Damien Vescari's face when he had looked at the cut lace. That wasn't performance. She had spent her career learning to identify something authentic about damaged things. The way the break told you about the original, the way you could read history in the wound. What she had seen on his face when he looked at the veil was grief. Not performed, not curated, old. She thought about what he had said. "This veil was in my mother's possession when she died, and it disappeared the same night she did." She looked at the car. She looked at the city. She picked up the hem of her dress and walked down the steps. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, which meant 40 minutes of silence in the back of a car with blacked-out windows and leather seats and no explanation, which was either a very good situation or a very bad one. And Vivian spent most of those 40 minutes categorizing evidence and trying to decide which. The driver offered nothing. The car was warm. Through the tinted glass, the October landscape moved past, the city giving way to the edge of it, the edge giving way to the kind of land that had been in private hands for long enough that it looked like nature rather than property. The trees old enough that they understood the shape of winter. She still had the veil pieces in her hair. She hadn't thought about removing them. She reached up now and began to take them down, carefully, holding each piece in her lap. The cut edges were clean, as she had told Margot. The silk was cold in her hands. She thought about what it meant that this veil had a history she hadn't known. She thought about the estate sale in Florence that Margot had described. Allegedly, 8 years ago, through a dealer whose name Margot had provided when Vivian had asked about provenance. Because, of course she had asked. She always asked. And she thought about how easy it was to construct a paper trail that looked legitimate if you knew what paperwork was supposed to look like. She thought about the Blackwells' art collection, the Blackwells' antique furniture, the Blackwells' habit, which she had absorbed slowly and almost without noticing, of surrounding themselves with beautiful things and discussing their acquisition in a language that emphasized taste and connoisseurship rather than mechanism. She thought about Damien Vescari saying your family acquired it through channels I will be examining in detail. The car stopped. The estate was not what she expected, which she understood later was because she had been expecting something that announced itself. Gates with crests, a driveway designed to impress. Instead, there was a stone wall set back from the road, and a gate that was solid iron, unornamented, and a driveway that was long and straight and brought you to a house that was large but not palatial, gray stone, old, the kind of building that had been built to last rather than to be looked at. The driver opened her door. She got out. The night air was sharp with October cold and the smell of wet stone and old trees. All the pieces of the veil were in her hands. Damien Vescari was standing on the front steps. He had removed the jacket. He was in shirt sleeves, and she noticed that he looked less composed out here in the cold than he had in the cathedral. Not disheveled, but human in a way the cathedral's formality had made difficult to see. He was looking at the pieces of lace in her hands, and for a moment he forgot, she thought, that he was looking at her holding them. He was just looking at the lace. Then he looked up. "You brought them," he said. "They're my property," she said, "until I understand otherwise." Something in his expression registered that, acknowledged it, maybe even respected it. "Come inside," he said. "I'll explain." She looked at him for a moment. "You should know," she said, "that I left a message with my emergency contact with the name of this address and the time I arrived." A pause. "That was intelligent," he said. "Good." She walked up the steps. The inside of the house was warmer than the outside, and it had the particular atmosphere of a space that was well maintained but not decorated for performance. No museum-quality displays, no careful arrangements of objects chosen to project taste. There were books, genuinely used. There was a fireplace in the main hall with a fire in it that had been burning long enough to make the room smell of oak and ash. There were pieces of furniture that were old but not precious, comfortable in the way of things that had been sat in for decades rather than preserved. He led her to a room that was clearly a study or a library. 2 walls of books, a large central table currently occupied by folders and what looked like architectural diagrams. He cleared one end of the table with a single efficient sweep of his forearm. "Put them here," he said. She set the pieces of the veil on the cleared surface. He looked at them for a long moment, and the silence had the quality of something personal in it, something that was not for her, and she let it be because she understood that kind of silence. "My mother's name was Rosalind Viscari," he said finally. "She died when I was 9 years old. The circumstances were—" A pause. The pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of a man choosing words carefully because the inaccurate ones would be intolerable. "Listed as an accident. I have spent a significant portion of my adult life understanding that this was not accurate." The veil was hers. The veil was her mother's and her grandmother's before that. It came from a family in Lombardy. He picked up one of the cut pieces with a precision that surprised her, not touching the lace itself, but holding it at the edge of the silk binding, the way a trained handler would. "Rosalind wore it at her own wedding. She told me when I was small that it was the thing she would give me to give to whoever I—" He stopped, set the piece down. "It disappeared the night she died. I have been looking for it for 11 years. Vivian looked at the pieces laid out on the table. "How did the Blackwells get it?" she said. It came out flat, not quite a question. "That is something I intend to determine." He looked up from the table. "I need to ask you something." She waited. The veil was damaged before tonight, before what was done to it at the cathedral. He watched her face. "There are areas of the original embroidery, particular sections along the border, and one significant area in the central panel, where the threadwork has been disturbed, not deterioration, not age. The pattern was deliberately altered, and the alteration was done with extraordinary skill." A pause. Someone hid something in the embroidery, and someone else, at some point, tried to access it. The room was very quiet. "What kind of something?" Vivian said. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's why I need someone who can actually read the lace." His eyes were steady on her. "I've been told you're the best textile restoration specialist in New England." "I've been told that too," she said. "It's probably accurate." Something that was almost not quite a smile crossed his face. "The veil needs to be restored," he said. "Completely. If there's a message in the embroidery, I need to find it. If there are sections that were altered, I need to understand how and when." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay here and do that work." She looked at him. "How long?" "I don't know. Weeks, possibly. The work will be, he glanced at the pieces, complex. I have other obligations. I'll compensate you for the interruption to your schedule generously." She looked at the veil again, looked at the cut edges, the hanging silk, the centuries of threadwork that had survived an ocean crossing and a warehouse fire, and 230 years of history, and had ended up here, on a table in a stone house outside Boston, damaged by people who had done it out of nothing more than petty cruelty. "The embroidery technique," she said, the original work. What period do you think it's from?" He blinked, the first sign she had seen of something catching him off guard. "My mother said the core of the veil was 18th century, Italian, Venetian, point lace, but she believed some sections were added later. A different hand," she said. "From a different time, Vivian leaned over the table. She looked at the cut edges closely, and then she looked at the intact sections, and even in the warm lamplight, she could see what he was talking about. The difference in thread weight in two of the border panels, the barely perceptible variation in the needle angle in a section of the central field. Her pulse changed. She straightened up. "I'll need my equipment," she said. "I left most of it at the cathedral venue's staging area. A large black case and a rolling tray with sealed containers. I'll have them collected tonight. I'll need good light, not overhead. Side lighting, adjustable. There's a conservation room on the second floor that was set up for my mother's pieces. I'll have it prepared." She looked at him. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for something and was now, for the first time in a long time, beginning to believe he might get it. "One more thing," she said. "Name it. I want to know everything you know about how this veil disappeared. Everything. Not a summary. The details. The night. What happened?" She held his gaze. "If I'm going to read this piece, I need to understand what it's been through." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a short conversation," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back. And the fire in the main hall was still burning, and the October cold was at all the windows, and the ruined lace was between them on the table. And something in the room settled, not into comfort exactly, but into the shape of something that was going to take time. "It started," Damien Viscari said finally, "the night my father came home early. She pulled out a chair. She sat down. She listened. And outside, on the other side of the city, in the wreckage of a wedding that would appear in every social column in Boston by morning, Celeste Blackwell was making a phone call to a number she had memorized but never before used, a number that would connect her within 48 hours to the one person who had as much reason to want the truth buried as she did. She didn't know yet that the woman she had dismissed as unworthy was already inside the house that held every answer. She didn't know yet that the veil was not destroyed. It was in the hands of the only person capable of reading what was hidden inside it. And she didn't know, no one did, not yet, that Rosalind Viscari had not simply left evidence in those threads. She had left a confession. The first thing Vivian learned about Damien Viscari was that he talked about his mother the way people talk about wounds they've stopped expecting to heal. Not with drama. Not with the performed grief of someone who had learned that grief could be a social currency. He talked about Rosalind Viscari, the way you describe a room you were locked out of for 20 years, in precise, careful detail, because the details were all you had left, and you had memorized every one of them, and the memorization was a form of keeping the door from disappearing entirely. He told her about the night in fragments, the way memory actually works rather than the way stories pretend it does. He had been 9. His father, Marco Viscari, had come home 3 hours early from a business meeting in Providence, which was unusual enough that Damien remembered registering it. The sound of the car in the drive at the wrong time. The particular quality of the silence that followed. The kind of silence that has a direction to it. A weight. That a child can feel through floors and walls without understanding what it means. He had stayed in his room. He had heard voices, his father's and another one, lower, that he had not recognized as a child, but had since identified. In the morning, his mother was gone. He said it that simply. In the morning, his mother was gone. No build-up, no pause for effect. Vivian watched his face while he said it, and his face did not change, which told her more than any expression would have. The official account was a car accident on Route 1A at 2:17 in the morning. Rosalind Viscari had been driving alone. The car had gone into the water. The body had been recovered. The veil and most of her personal effects had been in the car, and most personal effects did not survive saltwater immersion, which was a reasonable explanation for their absence at the subsequent inventory of her estate. "And you believe that," Vivian said, not as an accusation, as a question about a 9-year-old boy. "I believed it until I was 22, he said. "Then I found the accident report." A pause. The car entered the water on the passenger side. The impact pattern on the driver's door was consistent with another vehicle. He looked at the table. "My father's insurance company settled the question of the report without any public proceeding. The investigator who filed the original findings retired to a property in southern Portugal 6 weeks later." Vivian said nothing. "The veil wasn't in the car," he said. I confirmed that 11 years ago through a source inside the recovery operation who was still alive and had kept records. The veil was taken before the car went into the water, by whoever made it go into the water. He looked up. And then it moved. Through 3 intermediaries, 2 auction houses, and a private dealer in Florence who sells provenance documentation as a service, before the Blackwells acquired it 7 years ago. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Vivian looked at the pieces of lace on the table. She thought about Margot Blackwell handing her the veil 2 weeks ago, presenting it as an engagement gift, describing the Florence acquisition with the particular fluency of someone who had rehearsed the explanation enough times that it had acquired the texture of truth. She thought about Margot's face when she had found Vivian holding the cut pieces. Oh, how dreadful. What happened? She knew what it was, Vivian said. Margot, she knew whose it was. Damien looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. She gave it to me anyway. She gave it to you as a display piece, as proof that it was legitimately theirs, integrated into a family occasion. A pause. The best way to launder the history of an object is to make it part of a story that everyone witnesses. Vivian absorbed that. And then Celeste destroyed it, she said, before the story could finish being told. Celeste destroyed it, he said, because she is 28 years old and impulsive, and she hates you, and she didn't understand what the veil actually was. He paused. That was a mistake, Celeste's mistake. It brought me through that door. She looked at him. How did you know to be there? She said. I have had someone watching the veil for 3 years, he said simply, since I confirmed it was in Blackwell possession. I was waiting for the right moment to take it back without a confrontation that would obscure what I actually needed. A pause. A wedding attended by 500 members of the East Coast establishment was not the moment I would have chosen. Something that was almost a laugh moved through Vivian's chest without quite becoming one. No, she said. I imagine not. He refilled her coffee. It was past midnight. The fire had settled into steady coals. Get some sleep, he said. The conservation room will be ready by morning. We can begin examining the veil properly when there's daylight. She looked at the lace pieces. I'm not going to be able to sleep, she said. No, he agreed. Probably not. She slept for 4 hours, which surprised her. The room she was given was on the 2nd floor, simply furnished, well-heated, with windows that looked out over the back of the property and the dark shapes of old trees in the October dark. She woke at 6 to gray light and the smell of coffee from somewhere below and the immediate total return of everything that had happened in the last 18 hours, which arrived with the specific unpleasantness of reality asserting itself before the body has fully remembered how to deal with it. She lay there for 60 seconds. Then she got up. She had nothing to change into. Her clothes from the night before were a white dress that had been expensive and was now a problem, and an overcoat she had borrowed from one of Damien's staff when they had moved the veil to the conservation room around 2 in the morning. She put the overcoat back on over the dress and went downstairs. Damien was already at the kitchen table with coffee and a phone and what looked like a financial document. He was in dark trousers and a white shirt, still in the sleeves-up position from the night before, and he looked like he had slept approximately as much as she had, which was to say, not enough, which was visible in the set of his jaw. He looked up when she entered. There are clothes in the second wardrobe in your room, he said. My assistant had them sent this morning. She kept the sizes approximate. Your assistant works at 6 in the morning? My assistant works whenever I need her to. Vivian poured coffee. That seems like a difficult employment arrangement. She's compensated accordingly. Vivian sat down at the opposite end of the table. She looked at his documents without trying to read them. You've been awake. I don't sleep much. He set the phone down. The Blackwell situation developed overnight. She waited. Grant Blackwell issued a statement at 11 last night through the family's PR firm. The wedding was postponed due to the exact language is unforeseen circumstances that the families are managing privately. There's no mention of the veil, no mention of me. A pause. The social columns are filling the gap themselves. And your statement? I don't make statements. He picked up his coffee. I make moves. She drank her coffee. It was very good. The kind of good that required attention and actual beans, not a machine. What kind of moves? She said. He looked at her for a moment, assessing something. The Blackwells hold significant positions in 3 real estate investment trusts that rely on municipal contracts, he said. 2 of those contracts are up for renewal in January. The city councilman who chairs the relevant committee has a relationship with my family that predates the Blackwells' involvement in that sector by 15 years. A pause. I made a call this morning. That's not a legal strategy. No, he agreed. It isn't. He watched her face. Is that a problem for you? She thought about Celeste's scissors. She thought about Margot's face. She thought about Grant calculating behind his composure as she walked down the aisle. Tell me when it becomes one, she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter than that. The conservation room was exactly what he had described and better than she had expected. The lighting was professional, track-mounted, adjustable, with a side-angle lamp on an articulated arm that could be positioned to graze the surface of the textile and reveal structural details invisible under direct illumination. The table was covered in acid-free felt. There were magnification tools, good ones, and the atmosphere was controlled, temperature and humidity both stable, which was the single most important condition for working with material this old. She spent the first 3 hours not touching the veil at all. She looked at it. That was the work, the looking. The reassembly of the pieces on the felt surface, edge to edge, until the overall form was visible again, and she could begin to understand the whole before she interrogated the parts. Damien came in once, stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, and left without interrupting her. She noted that and filed it. By the second hour, she had found the first anomaly. It was in the lower right border section, an area that had been cut by Celeste's scissors but not destroyed. The silk was severed, but the embroidery itself was intact. The needlework in this section was different from the surrounding area in a way that wasn't visible to the naked eye but was absolutely clear under 4 times magnification. The thread was the same weight, the same approximate color, the same material, but the angle of entry into the base fabric was off by approximately 8 degrees from the dominant pattern. And the tension was different, tighter, more deliberate, the work of someone making a specific mark rather than following a decorative logic. She reached for her notebook. She began to map it. By noon, she had identified 4 separate anomalous sections. They were distributed across the veil in a pattern that looked random, but felt increasingly like it wasn't. She went downstairs. Damien was in the study with a man she hadn't seen before, 50s, compact, with the look of someone who had spent decades being useful in rooms where other people were making decisions. He stood when she entered, and Damien looked up, and the man's eyes moved to her face with the particular assessment of someone cataloging new information without any judgment attached. "This is Renard," Damien said. "He handles certain aspects of my operations." Renard nodded once. "Miss Hale." "There are 4 sections," Vivian said without preamble. "They're not decorative. Someone added them after the original work was completed. I'd estimate 1960s to 1980s based on the thread composition. Someone with real skill, someone who understood the original pattern well enough to embed new work inside it without disturbing the visual continuity." She looked at Damien. "Your mother?" A silence. "She studied textile restoration in Milan," he said, "before she married my father. She hid something, in 4 separate locations in the embroidery. Whatever it is, it's encoded. The sections individually look like embellishments, but I think spatially they form a reference system." She paused. "I need more time to decode the pattern, but I'm confident that's what this is." Damien looked at Renard. Renard said nothing, but his expression changed in a way that communicated something between them that Vivian didn't have the context to read yet. "How long?" Damien said. "Days? Not weeks." She looked at the notebook in her hands. "But I need to know more about your mother. What she knew. What she was afraid of in the period before she died." She looked up. "Whatever she hid in this veil, she hid it because she couldn't say it out loud. That means she was afraid, and that means the thing she was hiding was dangerous enough to be worth hiding in a way that required this kind of skill and this kind of time." A pause. "Who was she afraid of?" The room was quiet. Renard shifted his weight slightly, a small movement, but she caught it. She looked at him. He looked back with the neutral expression of a man who was very good at having neutral expressions. "Damien," she said, without looking away from Renard. Is there something about your family's situation that I need to understand before I continue this work? Damien was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Then tell me. Another pause. Then Renard stood and moved toward the door with the efficiency of someone used to knowing when a conversation had transitioned into one he shouldn't be in. When the door closed, Damien said, "Sit down." She sat. The name Lucien Viscari came out of him the way names like that always come out, with a particular economy, the way you name a specific kind of weather. Not dramatically, just accurately. Lucien was his father's younger brother, 12 years younger, which meant he had come into the family's operations at a different time and under different conditions than Marco Viscari, who had inherited the weight of the enterprise and been shaped by it. Lucien had been shaped instead by wanting, the specific wanting of someone who can see clearly what he doesn't have and has decided with complete commitment that this is someone else's fault. Your father, Vivian said. What happened to him? He died 4 years after my mother, heart failure officially. A pause. Lucien took control of the family's operations shortly afterward. By the time I was old enough to challenge that, he had restructured things in ways that took me 7 years to fully understand and another 4 to begin reversing. He looked at his hands. He is the voice I heard through the wall the night my mother disappeared. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. He had her killed, Vivian said. She found something out about what he was doing, Damien said. I believe she confronted him, or threatened to, and that he made the decision to eliminate the risk. A pause. I believe the thing she found out is what she encoded in the veil, and I believe she was trying to get the veil to someone she trusted on the night she died, and that she didn't make it. Vivienne looked at her notebook. And Lucien, she said, does he know the veil exists? Does he know what might be in it? He knows the veil exists. He has known for years. A pause. He doesn't know where it is. He's been looking. Damien's voice did not change in pitch or volume when he said the next part, which made it land harder. If he finds out it's here, he will come for it. And he won't care about the collateral. She looked up. He was watching her with the steady regard of a man who was telling her a hard truth deliberately, because she needed to have it in order to make an informed decision, and he was not going to soften it to make her stay. She respected that more than she wanted to. The Blackwells, she said. Where do they fit? Celeste Blackwell made a phone call last night, Renard said from outside the door. He was in the hallway, she realized, within earshot. A practical arrangement. To a number associated with Lucien's operation. The door opened. Renard came back in without ceremony and set a tablet on the table in front of Damien. On the screen was a phone record, time-stamped 11:43 p.m. Vivienne looked at it. She's already moving, she said. She made the call at 11:43, Renard said. It was answered. Duration 4 minutes and 12 seconds. What was said? We don't have the content yet. We'll have it by tonight. Vivienne sat back. She looked at the phone record and she thought about Celeste's face. The naked anger, that you have no idea what you just did. And she thought about what that really meant now, layered against everything Damien had just told her. Celeste wasn't just angry on behalf of herself and her family. Celeste was connected to something larger than a ruined wedding and a public humiliation, and she either understood that fully or she was being used by someone who did. And in either case, the call had been made and the machinery was in motion. She doesn't know what she's involved in, Vivienne said. Probably not, Damien agreed. Lucien finds people's anger and makes it useful. She'll find out. Yes, but by then... He stopped. By then it won't matter, Vivienne finished. He didn't contradict that. She looked at her notebook. She looked at the 4 mapped sections of anomalous embroidery. She thought about Rosalind Vescari, trained in restoration, working in secret on a piece of lace that had crossed an ocean, hiding something inside it with enough skill and patience that it had survived undetected for decades. A woman who knew she was in danger and couldn't speak, and chose instead to write in the only language she fully trusted, thread language. The language of patient, invisible work. The language of women who had spent centuries making beautiful things inside houses that did not belong to them. I'm going back upstairs, Vivienne said. She stood, closed the notebook. Don't interrupt me until I call for you. She was at the door when Damien said her name. She turned. When Renard gets the content of that call, he said, it may accelerate the timeline. If Lucien moves faster than I expect, he paused. I need you to be prepared to leave this house quickly if it becomes necessary. She looked at him. I'm not leaving until I finish the work, she said. His jaw tightened. Vivienne, I'm not leaving, she said. Your mother spent significant time hiding something in this lace because she needed someone to find it. I am going to find it. She held his gaze. Plan around that. She left before he could answer. Bob. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening without stopping except for coffee and once, a plate of food that someone left outside the conservation room door without knocking. A gesture she registered and appreciated without interrupting her concentration to acknowledge. By 7 in the evening, she had confirmed the pattern. The 4 anomalous sections were not independent. They were a map, not geographic but sequential, a system of reference points that used the existing decorative pattern of the veil as a coordinate grid. Each section modified the grid in a specific way, and when you read the modifications in the right order, they generated a sequence that Vivienne recognized, after an hour of staring at it, as a document reference system. Record numbers. Filing codes. The kind of alphanumeric sequences used by financial institutions and legal offices in the 1970s and 1980s. Rosalind Vescari had encoded the location of documentation. Vivienne's hands were shaking slightly when she wrote the final sequence in her notebook and checked it 3 times and confirmed that she had read it correctly. She was reaching for the door when it opened from the outside. Damien was there, and his expression had changed. The controlled quality had tightened into something harder, something that had been forced through a recent compression. We have the call content, he said. She waited. Celeste told Lucien that the veil is intact, that you have it. A pause. She told him you've been hired to restore it. The hallway was very quiet. How would she know that, Vivienne said. She doesn't know anything for certain. She's guessing based on what she saw at the cathedral, but the guess is accurate. His voice was very even. Lucien will have people moving within the hour. She looked at him. I found the sequence, she said. In the embroidery. Your mother encoded document references. Financial records, I think. Filing codes from the early 80s. Something moved across his face that she had no name for. Where are the records? I don't know yet. The sequence gives the reference codes, but not the institution or location. She held up the notebook. But it's a start. It's real. It's what she hid. She paused. It's enough to begin building a case. He looked at the notebook and then at her face, and the thing that moved across his expression this time was something older and more complicated than she had seen from him before. The specific expression of a man who has been looking for a door for 11 years and has just heard someone knock on it from the other side. He took a breath. Pack what you need, he said. We're moving you to the secure wing tonight. I told you I'm not... You're not leaving, he said. You're moving 20 feet down the hallway to a room with a reinforced door and a 2-man detail. His voice was flat, firm without being loud. That is not a negotiation. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the property, she heard a sound that might have been the wind through the trees and might have been something else. Something that stopped at the wrong moment. Something that had the particular quality of a sound that is trying not to be heard. Damien heard it too. She saw it in the way his attention shifted, the slight turn of his head, the stillness that went through him that was not fear but preparation. The difference between a man on alert and a man who has moved past alert into something older and more practiced. Now, he said quietly, and somewhere below them, in the dark of the estate's ground floor, a window broke. The window that broke was on the east side of the ground floor, which Damien knew without checking because he knew this house the way he knew his own breathing, by feel, by years, by the specific acoustic signature of every room and corridor and exterior wall. He had Vivienne by the arm before the last piece of glass settled. Not rough, but absolute. Move, he said. She moved. They went up the back staircase, not the main one, a narrow servant's passage that ran along the interior wall of the east wing, poorly lit, smelling of old wood and stone, and Vivienne ran in the white dress she had been wearing for 20 hours with her notebook clutched in one hand and her other hand on the wall for orientation, and she did not ask questions, which he registered in some peripheral part of his attention as the behavior of someone who understood when a situation had passed the point of discussion. Behind them, below them, she heard voices. Low, professional, no shouting, which was worse than shouting. Shouting was adrenaline. This was method. Renard materialized from a doorway at the top of the stairs. He had a phone in one hand, and his expression had the compressed quality of someone processing multiple information streams simultaneously. 4, he said to Damien. East window and the service door simultaneously. Morel's team has 2 at the perimeter. The veil already moved 30 seconds ago. Damien looked at him. You moved it before I called. I heard the wind change, Renard said simply. Vivian looked at Renard, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was something ancient about the way these men operated. A fluency in threat that had been developed over so much time that it had become a kind of second language, something spoken below the level of conscious thought. Damien put her in a room at the end of the corridor, the secure room he had mentioned, and she understood now what that meant in practice. A door with a steel core faced in wood, 2 bolt locks, windows with interior shutters of the same material. It looked like a guest room until you looked at the door frame and understood the depth of it. Stay, he said. I need the notebook. You have the notebook. He looked at it in her hand. Don't open the door for anyone except Renard or me. If someone else comes through that door, the window faces the north garden. There's a car at the north gate. Keys are above the left rear wheel. He held her eyes. You understand. She looked at him. His face was very close and very controlled, and there was something in his eyes that was not about the tactical situation, something that was there and visible for exactly 2 seconds before he put it away and the door closed and the locks engaged from the outside. She stood in the room. She listened. Jet. It took 11 minutes. She counted them on the clock on the bedside table, which had the luminous face of an old wind-up mechanism, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the white dress with the notebook in her lap, and she listened to the sounds of the house, and she thought, with the particular clarity that fear produces in people who have learned not to be overwhelmed by it, about the sequence she had decoded. Record references. Filing codes. An institution she hadn't yet identified. Rosalind Viscari had encoded these not as a personal record, but as a transmission. Something meant to be read by someone else. Someone who would know what to do with financial documentation from the early 1980s pointing to transactions in a criminal enterprise. She had been building a case. In secret, inside a piece of lace, using the only skill she had that no one around her would have understood or monitored. Vivienne thought about the patience that required, the kind of patience you develop when you have no other options. On the 11th minute, the sounds below resolved into a different register. Not the low professional quiet of an active operation, but the specific atmosphere of an aftermath, movements that were deliberate rather than urgent, voices at normal pitch. 3 minutes later, the locks disengaged. Damien opened the door. Ian. He had a cut on his left forearm. Not deep, the kind of cut you get from broken glass or a glancing contact, already stopped bleeding and unaddressed. His shirt was untucked on one side. He looked at her, and something in his face released by a fraction. It's clear, he said. How many? 4 came in. 2 are in custody. 2 ran when Morel's team closed the perimeter. He came into the room and leaned against the wall with the specific tiredness of someone who has been running on operational focus and is now, in the absence of immediate threat, feeling the weight of everything underneath it. No casualties. Your arm. It's nothing. She stood up, went to the bathroom, came back with a damp cloth, and handed it to him without ceremony. He looked at it, then at her, and took it. They were Lucien's people, he said, pressing the cloth to his forearm, confirmed by the 2 we have. He moved faster than I expected. A pause. Celeste's call gave him enough. He knows I decoded the veil. He knows you're working on it. He doesn't know what you found yet. Damien looked at her. We need to move that information tonight. Off this property, off any system that has a connection to my name. She held up the notebook. It's in here. Nowhere else. I need you to tell me the sequence. She read it to him. 12 alphanumeric codes, grouped in 3 sets of 4. He listened with the focused attention of someone memorizing rather than recording, which was, she understood, entirely intentional. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then something changed in his face. It was subtle and it was fast, and she almost missed it. A compression, a tightening around the eyes that was not tactical but personal. Something the codes had triggered. "You recognize them," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "Damien. One of these prefixes?" he said. He stopped. Started again. The third set. The institution code in the third set. He looked at the wall rather than at her. "It's not a bank. It's not a legal filing office." A pause that had a specific texture, a held quality. "It's an internal ledger system, used by my family's operations in the early 80s. She stared at him. "These records," he said very carefully, "are inside the organization, not external documentation of wrongdoing. They're internal accounts." He turned and looked at her, and his face had gone through something in the last 30 seconds that she didn't have a full map for yet. Rosalind didn't encode evidence she was going to take to an outside authority. She encoded evidence she was going to use inside the family, Vivian said slowly. "Against Lucien, through my father." He stopped. "She was going to give this to Marco. She was building a case to show my father that his brother was stealing from him, betraying him, building a parallel operation." A pause. "And Lucien found out." The room had a different quality now. "Before she could get to your father," Vivian said. "Before she could get to him." The flat, final weight of it. She watched his face, and she understood that this was a different kind of information than he had been carrying before. The fact of his mother's murder, he had lived with that for years, had built his adult life partly around it, had made his peace, such as it was, with the shape of that loss. But this was the mechanism, the specific moment, the decision chain that had produced the accident on Route 1A at 2:17 in the morning. And there was a difference, she knew from her own life, between knowing something terrible happened and knowing exactly how it was arranged. The human sequence of choices, the moment when prevention had still been possible. He had gone very still. "The records still exist," she said. "If your mother encoded the reference numbers, she believed they were accessible. Internal ledgers from that period were maintained in physical form. Copies would have been distributed to 3 locations." His voice was careful, reconstructive. "One copy would have been destroyed when Lucien consolidated control after my father died. One copy is in a secure storage facility in Providence that I control." A pause. "And one copy would have been in my father's private files." "Where are your father's private files?" He looked at her. "Lucien's house," he said. The silence after that had a particular completeness to it. The 2 men in custody were in a room in the basement that Vivian had not seen and did not ask to see. Renard handled that, and she understood from the way he and Damien communicated about it, economically, in half sentences that assumed a shared context, that this was a practiced arrangement, a division of labor that had evolved over years of operating in circumstances where official channels were either unavailable or counterproductive. What came back from that room within 40 minutes was a name. Not Lucien's name, she already had that, a different name. She was in the kitchen when Renard came upstairs and spoke to Damien in the doorway, and she heard it because the house was quiet now, and she was 12 feet away and not pretending otherwise. The name was Harlan Moss. She didn't know it, but the way Damien received it told her everything she needed to know about its weight. The absolute stillness, the specific quality of a man encountering confirmation of something he has suspected and hoped was wrong. Renard went back downstairs. Damien stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Then he came to the table and sat down across from her and put both his hands flat on the surface and looked at them, and she waited. "Harlan Moss," he said, "is my head of security." She looked at him. "Has been for 6 years," he said. "He manages the perimeter of this property, the access protocols, the communication systems." A pause that had a jagged edge. "He knew you were here. He knew the veil was here. He knew what you were working on." Another pause. "He made a call 4 hours ago to a number I'm now confirming connects to Lucien's operation." The kitchen was very quiet. "He let them in," Vivian said. "He coordinated the entry point, told them which window, which timing, what the patrol rotation looked like." Damien's hands were still flat on the table. 6 years. He came to me with references I verified through 3 independent sources. He has been in this house for 6 years. She watched his face, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read damaged things, that this was the wound that was going to cost him. Not the intrusion, not the tactical failure. The 6 years. The breakfasting across the table from someone who was counting down. The trust that had been placed and accepted and used as a mechanism. "Where is he now?" she said. "Gone. He left the property 40 minutes before the breach. The timing was clean, within the window where his absence would be attributed to an off-duty rotation." Damien looked up from his hands. "He planned it. He's been planning it." A pause. "Lucien didn't just send 4 men tonight. He sent them through my own house." She thought about the 4 anomalous sections in the veil. She thought about Rosalind Vescari working in secret inside a house that was also not entirely safe, encoding a message into lace because she had understood, with the specific intelligence of a woman in danger, that the message needed to be in a form that no one around her could read. She thought about what it meant to be in the right place with the wrong people. "The Providence storage facility," she said. "The copy of the internal ledgers. Is it still secure?" He was looking at her. "You think Moss gave Lucien the location?" "I think Moss has been working for Lucien for 6 years and has had access to everything you know and everything you have," she said. "So yes, I think we should assume that whatever Moss knew, Lucien knows." Damien's jaw was tight. He pulled out his phone. He made a call that lasted 45 seconds. He asked 2 questions. He listened to the answers. He set the phone down. "The Providence facility was accessed 3 hours ago," he said. "Security footage shows 2 men with valid credentials. Credentials that were issued through my system through Moss's administrative access." He stopped. "The ledgers from that storage unit are gone." The kitchen seemed to contract. 1 copy gone. 1 copy at Lucien's house. 1 copy destroyed years ago. Vivienne looked at the notebook in her hands. "The sequence I decoded," she said slowly. "The reference codes. They don't lead to the ledgers themselves. They lead to the entries. Specific entries in specific accounts at specific dates." She turned the notebook over in her hands. If someone had those reference numbers and knew the ledger system, they could reconstruct the relevant transactions even from a partial copy. She looked up. "Does Lucien know the sequence?" "Moss didn't have the sequence," Damien said. "I memorized it. You have it written here." He looked at the notebook. "But Lucien knows a sequence exists. Celeste told him you were decoding the veil. He'll know that whatever you found is the thing he's been trying to bury for 20 years. "Then he's going to come for the notebook," she said. "He's going to come for you," Damien said. "The notebook is portable. You carry it. Taking you is cleaner than hunting a piece of paper." She looked at him. The specific reality of what he had just said settled through her with a physical quality. Not panic, but a kind of cold, comprehensive understanding, the feeling of a situation closing around you like a hand. She had walked into a car outside a cathedral 24 hours ago because a man she didn't know had said he could explain a piece of lace. Now she was sitting in a compromised house with a target on her and a notebook containing the key to a 20-year-old murder and no clear path to making that information do what it needed to do before the man who had arranged the murder found a way to make both her and the information disappear. She breathed. She thought. "The 3rd copy," she said, "in your father's files, at Lucien's house. I can't access Lucien's house. He has his own security, his own people, and he'll be expecting a move from me now." A pause. "A direct approach would be anticipated, countered, and would likely destroy the files before I reached them." "Then you can't go," she said. He looked at her. "You," she said, and the word surprised her slightly as it came out, "are the person he's expecting. You're the known variable, the threat he's been managing for years." She kept her eyes on his face. "But I'm not." The silence lasted several seconds. "No," he said. "I'm a textile restoration specialist who walked into this situation by accident. I have no connection to your organization. I have no established pattern of behavior that Lucien's people would have mapped. You're a civilian," he said, and his voice had a different quality now, a hardness that was not anger, but was something close to it, something that came from a place she hadn't seen him access before. "I'm a civilian who has the sequence memorized," she touched her temple, "and who has nothing to lose in that house that I haven't already lost." She held his gaze. My former employer just had me publicly humiliated. My apartment lease runs out in 6 weeks. The commission that was the center of my professional life for 6 months no longer exists." She paused. "What exactly are you protecting me from, besides the thing I'm already inside?" He looked at her for a long time. "My mother," he said finally, "was a civilian. She was intelligent and careful, and she hid things in lace because she was trying to handle a dangerous situation through skill rather than direct confrontation." A pause. "It got her killed." The kitchen was very still. "She was alone," Vivian said quietly. "She didn't have anyone who knew what she knew." She looked at him. "I have you." Something moved through his face. Complex, layered, the expression of a man encountering a sentence that has gone directly through his defenses and struck something he hadn't prepared for. He looked away. He looked back. "There's a woman," he said, very carefully, "who owes me a significant favor. She has access to Lucian's household in a legitimate professional capacity." He was thinking while he spoke, assembling it in real time. "It would take 2 days to arrange." "Arrange it." "Vivian, arrange it," she said again. "We use what we have. We do it before Lucian decides that the conversation I could have with a federal prosecutor is more dangerous to him than whatever it costs to make me stop having it." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a gesture of comfort, she thought, a gesture of acknowledgement, of one person recognizing another. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she agreed. Outside, the October dark pressed at the kitchen windows, and somewhere in the city, in a house that Vivian had never seen, a man named Lucien Viscari was looking at a phone report that told him the operation had partially failed, and his expression as he read it was the expression of someone recalculating. A man who had spent 20 years arranging the disappearance of inconvenient truths and was now facing the specific problem of a woman who had survived one night in his path and was, against all reasonable expectation, preparing to take a step directly toward him. He picked up his phone. He made a call. And the voice that answered on the other end was one that Damien Viscari, 40 minutes away in a stone house in the dark, would not have recognized, because it belonged to someone he had never thought to suspect, someone who had been in his life not for 6 years but for 20, someone whose name would arrive like a physical blow when it finally surfaced. And by the time it did, Vivian would already be inside Lucien's house, and the last piece of the betrayal would be waiting for her there in the dark, like a door opening onto nothing. The 2 days felt like 2 weeks and passed like 2 hours. Damien moved them off the estate before dawn. A different property, smaller, a converted carriage house on the western edge of the city that had no connection to his name in any document that Moss would have accessed. Vivian carried the notebook and the pieces of the veil in an acid-free portfolio case that one of Renard's people had assembled from the conservation room supplies, and she sat in the back of a different car on a different road and watched the gray pre-dawn city move past the windows and thought about Rosalind Vescari making her own version of this drive 20-something years ago, carrying something that could not be allowed to disappear, trying to get it somewhere safe before the window closed. The window had closed for Rosalind. Vivian was not going to let that happen again. The carriage house was warm and functional and anonymous. Renard had people she didn't meet stationed at the perimeter in configurations she didn't ask about. Damien worked the phone for most of the first day. Calls she wasn't present for. In the small back room, the door not quite closed, his voice audible as a rhythm without content. She used the time to complete her mapping of the veil's encoded sections, working at the kitchen table under a portable side lamp, confirming the sequence twice more, building a written analysis of the encoding methodology that could stand as independent documentation if the notebook itself were lost or destroyed. She was thorough. She was fast. She did not let herself think about what came next until the work in front of her was done, because that was the only way she knew to move through situations that were larger than she had prepared for. The woman Damien had mentioned arrived on the afternoon of the second day. Her name was Petra, and she was 53 years old and had the specific bearing of someone who had spent decades being underestimated and had decided at some point to use that as a tool. She ran a private archival consultancy that served several of Boston's oldest families, which meant she moved through the houses of the powerful in a professional capacity that made her functionally invisible. The person who cataloged the library, organized the estate papers, assessed the provenance of inherited pieces. She had been doing work of this kind for Lucien Vescari for 4 years. She sat at the kitchen table across from Vivienne, and she looked at the sequence in the notebook, and she said, I know exactly where those files are. Vivienne looked at her. Third floor study, Petra said. He calls it the archive room. No one goes in there except him and the woman who cleans it, and she doesn't read. She looked at the reference codes. I've seen the cabinet system. Old lateral files, metal, olive green, the kind that were standard issue in the 70s and 80s. He has 12 of them. He keeps the room locked, but the lock is a standard key mechanism, not electronic. A pause. The alarm on that floor is on a separate circuit from the rest of the house. It was installed in 1994 and has not been updated. You've assessed it, Vivienne said. I've been thorough in my work, Petra said, and left it there. She looked at Damien, who was standing near the window. There is a reception, Petra said, tomorrow evening. Lucien hosts a quarterly dinner for his legitimate business associates, catering staff, additional service personnel, a string ensemble, outside contractors, none of whom Lucien's security knows individually. She set her hands flat on the table. I can get one person in as part of the catering support staff. One person who can move through the house in a service capacity without triggering attention, access the back staircase to the third floor during the dinner service when the floor will be empty, and reach the archive room. The lock, Vivienne said. Petra set a small key on the table. I had it copied, she said, 8 months ago. I wasn't certain why at the time. She looked at Damien. Now I am. Damien looked at the key. One person, he said. It was not a question, but it had a question inside it. One person moving through a catered event raises no attention, Petra said. 2 people in a service role who are seen near the back stairs raises questions that lead to searches that lead to problems. She was direct about it. One person. The room was quiet. Vivienne picked up the key. Damien looked at her hand holding it. No, he said. I'm the one who knows the reference codes, she said. I'm the one who can locate the specific entries in a lateral file system in the dark in under 10 minutes because I have spent 15 years in archival storage rooms locating specific documents in unorganized collections. She held his gaze. How long would it take you? I'm not sending you in there. You're not sending me anywhere. I'm going. She closed her hand around the key. This is what I said 2 days ago, and my position hasn't changed. His jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working. If Lucien identifies you, he doesn't know my face, she said. He knows my name and my function. He won't be looking at the catering staff. A pause. Damien, this is the only way to get those records before he moves them or destroys them. You know that. He looked at her for a long time. I'll be outside, he said finally. Renard's team will be positioned at every exit. The moment you have the files, you signal and you move to the East Service entrance. 30 seconds, maximum. He was very precise, very controlled. If anything changes inside that house, anything, you abort. You don't improvise. You don't push. You get out. Understood. Say it back. Anything changes, I abort. I get out. She looked at him. I understand. He reached out and took her hand, the one holding the key, and held it for 3 seconds. And his expression during those 3 seconds was the most unguarded she had seen it, and then he let go. Tomorrow night, he said. Lucien Vescari's house was in Beacon Hill, 4 stories of federal period brick on a street where the property values had been stratospheric for so long that stratospheric was simply the baseline. It announced nothing except permanence. It had the particular quality of old Boston wealth, not the garish display of money recently acquired, but the settled confidence of resources that had been compounding for long enough that they had become environmental, simply the condition of the air. The catering van arrived at the service entrance at 6:15. Vivienne was in black, as they all were. The standard service uniform, hair back, the kind of invisible that working staff in wealthy houses spend their careers perfecting. She carried a tray. She kept her eyes at the correct level, not down, which reads as nervous, and not up, which reads as interested, but at the middle distance that says, I am here to do a specific job and I am doing it. The service entrance opened into a corridor that ran the length of the house to the main kitchen. The kitchen was controlled chaos, additional staff, 3 catering supervisors with tablets, the organized noise of food being plated and trays being loaded, and the particular anxiety of a professional kitchen operating at volume. Nobody looked at her. She was moving and she had a tray and she was in the right clothes, and that was all the credibility this environment required. She made 2 passes through the dining room during the early cocktail service. Lucien Vescari was at the far end of the main reception room. She had 1 second to look at him before she looked away, and 1 second was enough. He was 70, lean in a way that read as discipline rather than age, with the coloring of someone who had spent winters in warmer climates and the posture of a man who had not experienced physical uncertainty in a long time. He was talking to 2 men in the specific manner of someone who was accustomed to being the still point in any room, letting others move toward him, managing the distance. His eyes passed over the catering staff twice during the time she was in the room. He did not pause on her. She moved back through the kitchen. She found the back staircase behind a door marked staff and went up to it. The 3rd floor was empty and dim, the sounds of the dinner service arriving as a muffled underwater version of itself from 2 floors below. The hallway smelled of old paper and floor wax, and the particular accumulation of a house that had been meticulously maintained without ever being fully inhabited. A show house, a performance of domestic life rather than the thing itself. The archive room was the 3rd door. She had the key in her hand. Her pulse was at 140, and she was managing it with the same focused attention she used for delicate work, not suppressing it, but directing the energy. The key turned. The room was dark. She used the small flashlight Petra had given her. Narrow beam, low output, sufficient. The lateral files were exactly as described. 12 cabinets, olive green, labeled along the top with handwritten date-range tabs in a cramped, consistent script. She moved to the 3rd and 4th cabinets, which Petra had identified as the earliest period. She opened the 3rd cabinet. The files inside were dense, organized with the particular meticulousness of someone who had maintained them personally over decades. The tabs were dated. She found the correct year range in 40 seconds. She pulled the relevant drawer. The reference codes in the notebook were in her memory like a physical object. She moved through the files with both hands, reading the tab labels, locating the matching prefixes. The paper was old, not fragile, but carrying the specific smell and texture of documents that had been handled and then sealed away and not touched since. She found the first matching file in 3 minutes. She opened it. The documents were financial records, ledger entries, transaction records, transfer authorizations from the early 1980s. She couldn't read them fully in the time she had, but she could see enough. Figures in the hundreds of thousands, routing information through accounts she didn't recognize, authorization signatures at the bottom of each page. One signature repeated on every document. She looked at it. She knew that signature. She had seen it in the last 48 hours on the documents Damien had been reviewing at the kitchen table in the carriage house. She had seen it on the framed photograph in the hallway of the estate, a formal family portrait, 2 brothers, the older one's arm around the younger one's shoulder. The authorizing signature on every transaction was not Lucien's. It was Marco Vescari's. Vivienne stood in the dark with the file in her hands, and she understood, with the specific cold clarity of a finding that rewrites everything that preceded it, what she was looking at. Marco had not been the victim of his brother's ambition. Marco had been the architect of it. Every transaction in this file ran from Marco's authorization to Lucien's accounts. Not Lucien stealing from Marco, but Marco funneling the organization's resources through Lucien as a mechanism for deniability, building Lucien's power deliberately while maintaining the appearance of the legitimate heir. The 2 brothers had been in partnership, and Rosalind had discovered it not as an act of Lucien's betrayal of Marco, but as the evidence of Marco's betrayal of every person who had trusted the Vescari name. She had built her encoded case to show Damien's father's crimes, not to protect him, to expose him. And Marco, or Lucien on Marco's behalf, or both of them together, had killed her for it. Vivienne's hands were not shaking, which surprised her. She had moved past shaking into something colder, something that was not composure, but was the physical territory on the other side of it. She photographed every page with her phone, 22 documents. She worked fast, the narrow flashlight in her teeth, both hands on the papers, systematic. She was on the 18th page when she heard the footstep in the hallway. Not a staff member's footstep, too deliberate, too aware of itself, the step of someone moving with specific intent rather than passing through. She had the file back in the drawer, and the drawer closed and her body against the wall beside the door in 3 seconds, which was the mechanical response of a person who has discovered that they have faster physical instincts than they knew. The door opened. The light came on. Lucien Vescari stood in the doorway. He was alone. He was looking at the room with the particular attention of someone who has registered that something in the atmosphere has changed. A displacement of air, a scent, the specific sense that a space has been recently occupied. His eyes moved over the cabinets, the room, and then to the wall beside the door, where he couldn't see her. He took one step in. His hand was at his side, and the thing in his hand was small and dark, and she did not look at it directly, but she knew its shape. He took another step. "I know someone's in here," he said. His voice was even, almost conversational. The voice of a man who was not afraid because fear was an experience he had engineered out of his operational life 30 years ago. The third cabinet was opened. The humidity signature is off. A pause. "You're good. But this room is mine and I know every molecule of it." She breathed through her nose, slow, controlled. "Come out," he said. "I'm not going to ask twice." She came out. She stepped away from the wall and she was 2 feet from him and the light was full on her face, and he looked at her with the assessment of someone reading a new piece of information, cataloging it, placing it in relation to existing data. "The restoration woman," he said. "Vivian Hale," she said. She kept her voice flat. Giving him the name because he already had it, and keeping it was a performance of fear she couldn't afford. "You found something," he said. He was looking at her hands. She had nothing in them. "You found something and you photographed it and it's on your phone." His eyes moved to her pocket. "The transaction records," she said. "Authorization signatures, all of them." Something moved in his face. Not surprise, but a kind of finalization. The expression of a man receiving the confirmation of something he had been dreading and had also, in some remote part of himself, been waiting for. "You know what those signatures mean," he said. "Yes." "Then you understand," he said, "that this information is significantly more complicated than whatever version of events my nephew has given you." He moved slightly, not toward her, but repositioning, the way a conversation has a geometry that people navigate without acknowledging. Marco was not an innocent man. He was not a victim. If Damien builds a case on these records believing he is avenging his father's betrayal, he's not, she said. He's avenging his mother's murder. Those are different things. Lucien was quiet. His mother, he said, was going to destroy everything Marco built, everything Damien inherited, the organization that funded his education, his start, his entire position. A pause. She was going to take her son's future apart because she had decided that her conscience was more important than her family. She was going to tell the truth, Vivian said. That's not a moral failure. That's the opposite. That's a perspective, he said, that has the luxury of not having built anything. They looked at each other. He had the gun at his side. She had a phone in her pocket with 22 photographs on it and no clear path to the East Service exit and a man blocking the only door. "Give me the phone," he said. "No, Ms. Hale." His voice was patient, exhausted with patience. "I am 70 years old, and I have been managing the consequences of that night for 20 years, and I have no interest in inflicting unnecessary harm on a woman who walked into this situation by accident. Give me the phone, and I will have you escorted out of this house in this city, and you will not hear from me again. And Damien?" A pause. "That conversation is older than you," he said. "It doesn't concern you." "It concerns me," she said, "because I am standing in a room where I have just found evidence that a woman was murdered for knowing the truth, and the man who arranged it is telling me to hand over the proof and walk away." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to do that." Something in his expression changed, a flatness that was more frightening than anger, the expression of a man shifting from conversation to resolution. He raised the gun, and the window behind him exploded inward. Not a break, an implosion, the specific violence of a frame being taken out from the outside. and the two figures coming through it moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this before in conditions exactly like these. And the first one had Lucien's gun arm controlled before the second one had cleared the sill, and Renard's voice said, from directly behind Vivian's left ear, "Down." She dropped. The room was loud, and then it was not loud, and then it was very still. Lucien was on the floor, not injured, but contained, both arms held, his face pressed sideways against the archive room rug with an expression that had completed its transition from patience to something that was finally, after 20 years, the thing underneath everything else. Renard looked at Vivian. "You were 30 seconds past signal," he said. "I found something," she said. Her voice came out steady, which was a minor miracle. "Something that changes what we know. Tell me outside." "Where's Damien?" "Downstairs," Renard said. "He's been downstairs for 3 minutes. He came in through the front door." She stared at him. "He walked in the front door of Lucien's dinner party," she said. "He did," Renard said, in the tone of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything Damien Viscari decided to do when the people he cared about were at risk. She looked at Lucien on the floor. He was looking back at her with the flat, final expression of a man who understood that the room had changed in a way he was not going to be able to manage. And in his eyes was something she had not expected to see there. Not rage, not calculation, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a secret for 20 years and has just, in this moment, understood that the carrying is over. She stepped over him. She went out the door and down the hall toward the stairs, and the sounds of the dinner party 2 floors below had stopped entirely, replaced by the specific silence of a room full of people who have understood, suddenly and completely, that the evening has become something other than what they were told it would be. And somewhere in that silence was Damien Viscari's voice, even and carrying, saying something she couldn't yet hear. And she moved towards it down the dark staircase with 22 photographs on her phone, and the truth of Rosalind Viscari's death finally surfaced after 20 years in the dark. And the last flight of stairs was in front of her, and at the bottom of it was the man who had spent his entire adult life looking for this moment without knowing that the moment would cost him something he had not prepared to lose. The dining room of Lucien Viscari's house had gone completely still. 31 guests in evening wear sat at a table set with crystal and silver and the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and not one of them was moving. The string ensemble in the corner had stopped mid-phrase. The cellist still had her bow raised, frozen at the precise angle where the music had been when the sound of the window breaking 2 floors above had reached the dining room and converted the evening into something none of them had been prepared for. Damien stood at the head of the table. He had not touched the food. He had not touched anything. He stood with his hands at his sides in the dark suit he'd worn into the front door 20 minutes ago, and he had spoken to the room in the even, carrying voice she had heard from the staircase, and she understood now, descending the last flight and stepping into the doorway, what he had been saying. He had been telling them everything, not in the dramatic register of accusation, in the flat, precise register of a man reading a record into the evidence of witnesses, names, dates, account numbers he had memorized from the documents she had described to him, the outline of a 20-year operation built on the foundation of one woman's murder. He had been talking for 20 minutes to 31 people who collectively represented the legitimate business architecture that Lucien Viscari used as a public face, and he had been dismantling that face brick by brick in the language those people understood best: financial exposure, legal liability, the specific terminology of complicity. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. His eyes went to her face. A full second of assessment, checking for damage, for the particular quality of someone who has been through something and come out the other side carrying it. She gave him a small nod. The reading was intact, functional, altered. He received it. Something in his shoulders released by a fraction that no one else in the room would have noticed. Then his attention returned to the table. The documentation, he said, exists in physical form, currently secured, and in digital form, currently in transit to 3 separate locations, including the offices of an attorney who is not connected to my family or to any family represented at this table. He paused. What happens next is not my decision. It is yours. Every person in this room can choose tonight to be a witness or to be a subject. I recommend, he said, choosing witness. The silence that followed had the quality of 31 people running individual calculations simultaneously. Vivian walked into the room. She crossed to where Damien stood and she put the phone on the table in front of him, face up, the photographs visible on the screen. He looked at them. He scrolled through 3 of them without expression, and she watched his face for the moment she knew was coming, the moment he reached the authorization signatures. He stopped scrolling. He looked at the screen for a long time. She did not look away from his face. "Your father's signature," she said quietly. Not gently. Gently would have been an insult to both of them. Just accurately, the way you have to say a true thing. He didn't answer. She watched the thing move through him. The reconstruction, the recontextualization. 20 years of a story reassembling itself around a different center. The narrative he had been living inside. The one where his father was a flawed man who had been betrayed by his brother, the one that allowed him to grieve his mother and pursue his uncle and maintain somewhere in his chest a small preserved corner of something that was not quite love for a father who had died when he was 13. That narrative was being replaced by something colder and more complete, and she could see it happening, and she could not stop it, and she was not going to look away from it. His jaw worked once. She was going to expose him, he said. Still quiet. Still even. Yes. And he stopped. Marco or Lucien made the call, possibly together. The documentation shows the financial partnership, not the operational decision about your mother. But the authorization trail makes the motive clear. She held his gaze. Both of them, Damien? Not just Lucien. His father had been dead for 24 years. She understood, watching his face, that this was the specific cruelty of what she had just handed him, the way that the dead are not available to be confronted, to be made to account, to receive the fury and grief that their actions generate. Marco Viscari had died of heart failure at 51 and had been buried with the full weight of his family's mourning and his surviving son's complicated, preserved love. And that was permanent. And the thing Vivienne had just told Damien was that the mourning had been built on a structure that was not what it appeared, and the structure could not be corrected, and the man who built it was not present to be held. Only Lucien was present. As if on cue, Renard appeared in the dining room doorway with 2 of his people and Lucien Viscari between them, his hands held behind him, his dinner jacket slightly torn at the shoulder from the window entry, his face with the final exhausted flatness she had seen in the archive room. The 31 guests at the table registered his appearance, and the registering was audible. The specific sound of a room recalibrating what it has just been told against the physical reality of the man it has known. Lucien looked at the room. He looked at Damien. He did not look at Vivian, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. "It was both of you," Damien said. Lucien was quiet for a moment. "Your father," he said finally, "made decisions I advised against. Your mother found out. The situation required management." A pause. "I managed it." The particular ugliness of that word in that context, managed, moved through the room like a physical thing. "She was 29 years old," Damien said. "She was going to destroy everything. She was going to tell the truth." "Yes," Lucien said. And something in his voice was so devoid of apology, so purely pragmatic, that it was almost more honest than anything else that had been said in the room tonight. That's the same thing, in this life. Damien looked at him for a long time. Vivian watched Damien's hands. They were at his sides. Still. She thought about the gun she knew he was carrying, had been carrying since the night of the estate intrusion, the weight of it visible in the set of his jacket if you knew what you were looking at. She thought about the warehouse meeting that the outline of this story had always seemed to be building toward. She thought about what was available to him right now, in this room, with 31 witnesses and his mother's killer 4 feet away, and 20 years of every form of grief and fury that had been refined by time into something precise and ready. His hands did not move. "You're going to spend the rest of your life," he said to Lucien, "answering for this in rooms you can't control, in proceedings that will be public, in the presence of people whose professional purpose is to make the record complete." He paused. "I'm not going to do what you would have done, what my father would have done." Another pause. "That's the only thing I can give her now, not doing what you would have done." Lucien looked at him. For one moment, brief, real, unperformed, Something moved in the old man's face that was not triumph and not defiance, and not the pragmatic absence of remorse that had characterized everything he had said. It was something that might, in a different life, in a person who had made different decisions at a series of junctures now 40 years in the past, have been called recognition. Then it closed. "Take him," Damien said to Renard. "Pass him." The legal proceedings that followed were not clean or fast, because they never are. Vivienne spent 4 hours in the following 2 days with attorneys. Not Damien's attorneys, her own, a firm recommended by a museum colleague who had no connection to any of the parties involved. She gave a full account. She turned over the photographs. She documented the encoding methodology in the veil with the specificity of an expert witness, because that was what she was. And she was not going to be anything less than completely useful in this. The documentation she had photographed, combined with the sequence decoded from the veil's embroidery, was enough to open a formal investigation into the financial operations of the Vescari family's legitimate holding companies, which were the mechanism through which the historic transactions had been laundered. The criminal enterprise dimensions were more complex, so the statutes of limitations on the financial crimes had run, but the investigation into Rosalind Vescari's death was another matter, because there is no statute of limitations on murder in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the evidence now available provided the investigative foundation that had been absent 20 years ago when the accident report had been quietly settled. Lucien's attorneys were expensive and experienced and earned their fees slowing every process they touched. But slowing was not stopping. The Blackwell situation resolved faster and more completely than Vivienne had expected, because the Blackwells had been operating, she understood now, on the assumption that their connection to Lucien was a form of protection. When Lucien's situation became public, that assumption inverted. The municipal contracts went to a different firm in the January renewal. Grant's name appeared briefly in the investigative reporting in connection with the Veil's acquisition provenance, and then he was gone. No statement, no public presence, a quiet dissolution of all the visible architecture of his public life. Celeste was arrested in connection with the organized intrusion on Damien's estate and the role she had played in providing information that facilitated the attempted kidnapping. Her attorney negotiated a cooperation arrangement that served her interests and the prosecution simultaneously, which was the specific kind of outcome that left everyone involved feeling that justice had been approximately served without being fully satisfied. Margot Blackwell issued a statement through the family's PR firm that was a masterpiece of implication and non-admission, and it didn't matter because the statement was read by people who now knew what they knew, and the specific social infrastructure that the Blackwell name had represented was not destroyed. Nothing that substantial is destroyed by a single event, but it was permanently altered, the way a building is altered by a structural failure that is repaired but never quite forgotten. Vivienne did not follow any of this as it unfolded. She was working. The restoration of the Veil took 6 weeks. She worked at the estate, Damien's estate, the stone house with the old trees which had been resecured with thoroughness that she understood included a complete personnel review and the quiet departure of 3 additional people whose relationships with Moss had been too convenient. The conservation room on the 2nd floor became hers in the practical sense of a space that shapes itself around the person who uses it. Her portable lamp at the specific angle she preferred, her reference materials stacked in her particular order, the acid-free portfolio cases arranged on the side table with the organization that felt natural to her hands. She worked from 7 in the morning until the light changed in the late afternoon. She did not rush. The cuts made by Celeste's scissors had severed the silk binding in 4 locations and damaged the lace field in 2 others. These were the visible wounds. But working through the piece systematically, she found older damage. A repair made in the 1950s by someone skilled but not trained in the original technique. A section of the lower border where the base fabric had been treated with a preservative compound that had slightly stiffened the thread and required careful humidification before it could be worked again. A tiny tear in the central field that predated Rosalind's encoded additions by what she estimated as 30 years. Every generation had marked this piece, some with damage, some with care. She repaired all of it. For Celeste's cuts, she chose gold thread, not as decoration, not as statement, but because the metallic fiber had the right tensile properties for the repair technique she was using, and because it would hold. The gold ran through the cut lines like a seam, fine as wire, visible only at close examination but present, undeniable, honest about what had happened and what had been done in response. Damien came to the doorway of the conservation room most evenings. He rarely came in. He stood in the doorway with coffee for both of them, and he looked at the work in progress, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both felt natural in different ways. She had learned over the 6 weeks that he was a man who needed silence the way other people needed conversation, not as absence but as content, as a form of communication that he was more fluent in than words. She had learned that he was underneath the controlled surface that 20 years of operating in a world defined by threat had deposited over him. Funny. In the dry, deadpan, barely signaled way of someone who finds the world genuinely absurd and has decided that acknowledging it quietly is a sufficient response. She had learned that he read widely and remembered everything, and had opinions on architectural history that he articulated with a precision that made her suspect he had considered becoming an architect before the family situation had consumed the question of what he would become. She had learned that he never spoke about his mother casually. When he spoke about her, it was with the specific care of someone handling something that mattered too much for carelessness. On a Tuesday evening in the 6th week, she called him into the conservation room. He came in and stood beside her at the table and looked at the veil laid out on the acid-free felt under the side-angled light. It was finished. The cuts were sealed. The gold thread ran through the repair lines with the clean precision of intentional work. The damage incorporated rather than erased, visible as history rather than hidden as shame. The original lace breathed around the repairs, the centuries-old Italian needlepoint restored to its full visual coherence, the structural integrity of every section confirmed. Rosalind's encoded additions were intact, not exposed, not destroyed, but present within the piece as they had always been, now understood. The veil was not what it had been before Celeste's scissors. It was something else, something that had been through more and carried more, and was, she believed, more honest for it. Damien stood beside her and looked at it for a long time without speaking. She watched the side of his face, and she thought about a 9-year-old boy in a room above a conversation he couldn't hear, and she thought about everything that conversation had cost him. And she did not say any of that because it did not need to be said. "The gold," he said finally. "It's the strongest repair material for this technique," she said. "It'll hold longer than anything else I could have used." A pause. "It also doesn't pretend." He looked at her. "It doesn't pretend," he repeated. "The cuts happened. The damage is real. A repair that hides that, it's a kind of lie. This way, anyone who looks at the piece knows what it survived." She looked at the veil. "That's not weakness. That's just accuracy." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have understood that," he said. "I think she already did," Vivian said. "She spent years hiding truth in this piece because saying it out loud wasn't safe. She used her skill to preserve something she couldn't protect any other way." She looked at the encoded sections. She was working in gold too, just a different kind. He reached out and touched the edge of the veil. Not the lace itself, but the border, the silk, the way she had shown him to hold it in those first hours in the study when everything was still in pieces. The gesture was correct, careful in the way of someone who has learned what careful means. He withdrew his hand. "I want to do something with it," he said. "The veil. I've been thinking about where it belongs now." She waited. "There's a textile archive at the Boston Athenaeum," he said. "Restricted collection, climate-controlled, proper conservation protocols. They have pieces from similar periods, similar origins." He paused. "It would be protected. Properly." Another pause. "And it would be accessible, not locked away." She looked at him. "You're not keeping it." "I spent 11 years looking for a piece of fabric," he said. "I understand now that the looking was never really about the fabric." He looked at her with the direct, uncalculating regard that she had come to understand was his version of openness, the thing underneath the controlled surface when he chose to let it be visible. It was about not letting her disappear completely, about keeping something of her present. A pause. "I have something of her present now. It isn't fabric." The conservation room was very quiet. "Damien," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I'm saying." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the cathedral, 5 months ago, which felt like a decade and like yesterday simultaneously. The torn veil in her hands, the moment of choosing to walk out rather than hide. The specific quality of that choice, not brave exactly, but true. And truth had a physical sensation that she had not fully trusted in herself until that moment. She thought about the car at the curb, the drive through the dark, the stone house and the fire, and a man who talked about his mother the way you talk about wounds you've stopped expecting to heal. She thought about who she had been in that cathedral and who she was standing here now. And the distance between those two people was not large in time, but was significant in the way that the distances that matter most always are. Not geographic, but essential. "The Athenaeum is a good choice," she said. "For the veil." He nodded once. "And for the rest of it," she said carefully, "I think we're both going to need some time to be ordinary for a while, before anything else." Something moved across his face that was the closest thing to undefended she had seen it. "Ordinary," he said. "Coffee in the morning that isn't a crisis briefing. A meal that isn't being eaten standing up. A conversation that doesn't involve anyone's provenance documentation." She looked at him steadily. "I think we've both been operating at a level of intensity that makes it hard to know what anything actually is. And you think we should find out?" "I think we've earned the right to find out," she said. "Without the emergency." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the most terrifying thing you've said to me," he said. She looked at him. "More terrifying than breaking into your uncle's house." Significantly. A pause. "In that house, I knew what I was dealing with." She almost laughed. It came up through her chest without warning, real and surprised. And she let it, because it was real. And she had been choosing real things over performed things for 5 months now, and she was not going to stop. He didn't laugh, but something in his eyes changed in a way that was better. The veil was transferred to the Boston Athenaeum on a gray November morning, 6 days later. Vivian was there when it arrived. She had prepared the transfer documentation herself, condition report, treatment history, encoding analysis archived separately with the legal record, conservation recommendations for long-term storage. The portfolio was complete, the kind of complete that she could sign her name to without reservation. The Athenaeum's textile curator, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Emmeline Park, received the piece with the specific reverence of someone who had spent her career around objects that had survived more than they were supposed to and understood what that meant. She unfolded the tissue over the veil and looked at it for a long time. "The gold repairs," she said. "Yes," Vivian said. "They're extraordinary." A pause. "Did you choose the weight of the thread deliberately? The way it catches the light at an oblique angle rather than a direct one?" "Yes," Vivian said. "I wanted the repair to be visible when you're looking carefully, not when you're just passing by." Dr. Park looked up at her. "That's a philosophy," she said. "It's just honest work," Vivian said. Dr. Park looked at the veil for another moment. "Whoever made this original piece, the Italian lace maker, she would have understood what you've done here. It speaks to the original spirit of the work." Vivian looked at the veil. She thought about the woman in the northern Italian village whose name no one remembered. She thought about Rosalind Vescari at a workbench in a house that was not safe, needle in hand, encoding something she needed to survive her. She thought about all the women who had spent their patience and their skill on things that were intended to last and had, against considerable odds, been right about that. "Yes," she said. "I think she would have." Damien was waiting outside. He was standing at the edge of the Athenaeum steps in the gray November light, hands in his coat pockets, watching the street with the habitual vigilance of a man whose nervous system had been calibrated for threat over 20 years and was going to take more than a morning to recalibrate. He looked up when she came through the door. "Done," she said. He looked at her face, checking. It was a thing he did. She had noticed it over the 6 weeks, the way he checked her face at transitions, at the ends and beginnings of things. The small, consistent habit of someone verifying that the people they were responsible for were still intact. "Yes," she said, reading the check. "I'm fine. It's good. It's in the right place." He nodded once. He looked at the building for a moment, the old facade, the November sky behind it, the city going about its morning with the indifference of a city toward the specific human events occurring within it. "My mother hated November," he said. "It came out easily. Not performed, not effortful. Just a thing he knew about her that had surfaced. Why? Vivian said. Vivian. She said it was the month that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. A pause. Too cold for the last of autumn, not cold enough for winter to commit. He looked at the street. She preferred things that committed. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing, Vivian said. She was. He looked at her. You would have liked each other. The precision of it, the way you both... He stopped. Reconsidered the sentence, started again simply. She would have liked the gold thread. Vivian looked at him. The gray light was doing something to his face that was neither flattering nor unflattering, but simply honest, showing the lines that 20 years of operating at controlled tension had put there, the specific tiredness that was not exhaustion but accumulated weight. And underneath all of it, the thing she had first seen in the cathedral when he had looked at the ruined lace and been briefly, completely human. Coffee, she said. That is not a crisis briefing. Something in his jaw released. There's a place on Beacon Street, he said. I've walked past it for 3 years without going in. Why? It seemed like the kind of place that required not being in the middle of something. She looked at him. You're not in the middle of something, she said. Not right now. Right now you're on the steps of a building where your mother's veil has just been placed into the care of people who will protect it, and everything that needed to be answered has been answered. And Lucien is in a room he can't leave, and the Blackwells are managing their own consequences, and the morning is gray and cold and entirely ordinary. She paused. Go into the coffee shop, Damien. He looked at her for a moment. Then he came down the last 2 steps and stood beside her on the sidewalk, and they walked north on the Athenaeum Street toward Beacon, and the city moved around them with its ordinary indifference, and neither of them spoke, which was not silence as absence, but silence as the specific earned kind that 2 people share when they have been through something true together and have come out the other side and do not need to narrate it. The coffee shop was small and warm and smelled of dark roast and old wood, and they took a table by the window, and outside the gray November street went about its business. And inside, Vivian wrapped both hands around a cup that was too hot and looked across the table at a man who had spent 11 years hunting a piece of fabric and found, in the finding, something he had not known to look for. And she thought that this was perhaps how most of the important things arrived. Not announced, not planned for, but present suddenly in the aftermath of other searches, waiting in the place you reached only after you had stopped running and started looking. The coffee was very good. The morning committed to nothing in particular. That was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough.